Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Nicaragua webinar entitled Attempted Coups in Venezuela and Honduras, Their Meaning for Nicaragua and Beyond. My name is Barbara Larkham, and I'm one of your co-moderators today. We're looking forward to our two speakers, Francisco Dominguez. Francisco, oh, you want to wave to us? Okay. And Adrienne Pine. We will introduce them more fully in a few minutes, but first we have a few other comments and announcements.
Thanks, Barbara. I want to say hello. My name is Michelle Munjanat, and I am the co-moderator for this webinar. I'm an internationalist and trade unionist based in New York City, a member of the Friends of the ATC or Rural Workers Association in Nicaragua, and an observer of the incredible progress in Nicaragua under the Sandinista government. I've also just returned from the Congress Against Fascism held in Caracas, Venezuela, which inaugurated a new international against fascism, led by both Venezuela and the Russian Federation. I'm really eager to hear from both of our speakers today. We also want to thank Yoav Elenevsky and Erica Takeo, who are providing our technical support, and our many organizational co-sponsors who are being listed now in the chat. The webinars are hosted by Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition with a website at a new address, nicasolidarity.com.
And I'm taking a moment to paste our co-sponsors in the chat, I hope. I may have to wait on that. Thank you to our co-sponsors, and I will paste those in a moment. You'll see several buttons available at the bottom of your screen. One button is for closed captions labeled CC. Just click to turn that on. Also, feel free to use the chat function to offer comments throughout this event. But if you have a question for the speakers, please do not put your question in the chat or we may not see it. Instead, click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and place your question there. We'll select your questions from the Q&A to pose to our speakers. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be sent to all registrants within the next few days. When it's ready, it will also be posted at the new website, nicasolidarity.com, and on the YouTube channel of Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition. Also, many of our past recordings are also available on the website and YouTube channel.
Our next Nicaragua webinar will be held on November 17th, featuring the one and only Erica Takeo of Friends of the ATC, or the Association of Rural Workers. She will discuss their activities in Nicaragua and within the worldwide movement for food sovereignty and the rights of rural peoples. More information is coming soon, but please mark your calendars now for Sunday, November 17th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay. And Michelle, you want to keep going?
Sorry, thank you. If you'd like to be more active in supporting Nicaragua's sovereignty and opposing foreign interference there, please join the International Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition. You can check the website regularly at nicasolidarity.com. Also, please put your name and email address in the Q&A to get information about the Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition meetings and working groups. The next general meeting is tomorrow, Monday, October 14th. The coalition meets on the second Monday of each month at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, we're also putting some other links in the chat to subscribe to the Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition newsletter and action alerts, the NicaNet email list, and Nica Notes. We have one more request before we start today's program. Please act urgently on behalf of the Uhuru movement. A link to more information will be put in the chat. This multiracial movement has spoken out strongly on a theme that is unpopular in some elite circles, building political and economic power in the hands of African peoples. In June, we sponsored a special webinar featuring the Uhuru Three, Chairman Omali Yeshitela, Penny Hess, and Jesse Neville, who were then facing a trial in a U.S. federal court. In September, the jury found them not guilty of the charge of being foreign agents, but guilty of the vague charge of, quote, conspiracy to commit an offense against the U.S. government, end quote, when no specific offense was found. They face sentences of up to 5 years in prison. This test case could affect many of us, whether the U.S. government can openly attack, criminalize, and imprison people for exercising their right to free speech. Please write letters of support by this Tuesday, the deadline, October 15th, and consider helping to pack the courtroom in Florida for their sentencing on November 25th. See the link in the chat for more information. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara, for sharing that really important update. And now we turn to today's webinar with the following format. First, we'll hear from both speakers who will have each 15 minutes or so for their remarks. Then they'll have a brief period to offer comments and questions on each other's presentations before we open the discussion to your questions for the speakers. Please do keep entering your questions in the Q&A throughout the webinar. And generally, we're going to prioritize questions that deal with the topic of coups in both, attempted coups in both Honduras and Venezuela. Our first speaker is Dr. Francisco Dominguez, who is a senior lecturer at Middlesex University in the UK, where he heads the research group on Latin America. He is also the UK's National Secretary of the Venezuela Solidarity Campaign, and he serves as a member of the executive committees of the Nicaragua Solidarity Campaign Action Group and the Cuba Solidarity Campaign. He came to Britain in 1979 as a Chilean political refugee and has always been active on Latin American issues, which he has written and published extensively, including as co-author of Right-Wing Politics in the New Latin America, published by Zed Books. Francisco, welcome. You have the floor.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I think it's quite an important webinar because it discusses, the efforts by the United States to reassert through brutal methods, as always, its hegemony in the region. Hegemony that has been contested, particularly with the pink tide one, from, I would say, 1999 all the way to 2016, 14, 16. When, as a result of the crisis, the credit crunch that set in 2008, 2009, which affected our economies in Latin America quite badly because of the contraction of trade, particularly on raw materials, which led to the inability of these governments, particularly progressive governments, Brazil, Venezuela, and a few others, to be able to actually finance the social program, the progressive policies that they were trying to do. And the United States took advantage of these difficulties, capitalizing on them by destabilizing governments, overthrowing governments in Honduras in 2009, which is relevant to the discussion, then tried to organize a coup d'etat against Rafael Correa in Ecuador in 2010, overthrowing Fernando Lugo in Paraguay in 2012, and then following on, there is more, but there is no time, and then was able to impeach Dilma Rousseff in Brazil, the first ever woman president of the country, and was also able to arrange through their process inside the country in Brazil to actually put Lula in prison, allowing the conditions for the election of a fascist in Brazil, a guy called Jair Bolsonaro. So that is the context. So ever since the United States have been trying to deal with the most difficult ones, which are Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, and now the new one, the new kid in the block, I would say, is Honduras, which also has turned to be quite resilient. So what I want to concentrate now after that context is the attempt at a coup d'etat that took place recently, literally a few weeks away, or a few weeks earlier. This was in July 28th, July 29, when there were presidential elections that took place in Venezuela. I was an international observer in those elections myself. So I saw a few of the things that were reported later on, firsthand. Let me tell you how I think it happened. I detected several months before the election, I would say as early as February, if not March, if not even before, that the international media began to put out a narrative which suggested that Maduro was going to lose very badly the election. There was no evidence whatsoever to justify these claims. Nevertheless, all the international media, literally all of it, no exception, were pumping this narrative. And they were talking about 80% for the candidate of the extreme right wing, Edmundo Gonzalez. They were talking about 70%, 65%, this sort of thing. And they kept repeating it and repeating it and repeating it. Once that narrative was established in people's minds around the world, which is not difficult to do, then they began to say, well, the only possibility for Maduro to win is to actually organize some rigging of the election. That is to say, to engage in fraud. So the framework for what was coming was already in place. And I detected the uniformity of this message, from the most respectable, such as the Financial Times, to the worst possible ones, such as the Daily Mail, certainly in the UK, and worse in other places. I don't want to mention them, not to enter into any libelous problem, but you know what I'm saying. And all of them had exactly the same message. And in my view, there is only one center of power in the world that can command the total obedience of the world media, and that is in Washington. Nobody else can do it, only them. So therefore, the directive and the framework for this came from them. That was number one. Then number two, when the election took place, it took place very peacefully. There were no problems and so on until the results were announced. After the results were announced on the 28th of July in the evening, it took a long time for them to be announced. And the reason was there was a massive, gigantic cybernetic attack. I mean, I was flabbergasted. I don't know about these things that much myself, coming from a previous generation, if you see what I mean. But according to the Minister of Science and Technology in Venezuela, the amount of attacks, cyber attacks, were something like 35 million per minute. And not only the National Electoral Council system was being attacked, but also everything else that could be attacked was attacked, cybernetically speaking. And this is obviously a weapon that the United States had. Because of those attacks, the counting was massively delayed, and they were able to actually give the information with 80% of the votes counted by about 11:30 in the evening, when normally in Venezuela it takes about 1 or 2 hours because it's automatic, it's computerized. By that time, when that happened, I remember watching television myself from my hotel room. And then literally 30 seconds after the CNE, the National Electoral Council, announced the results, then Maria Corina Machado, an extreme right-wing politician, really viciously right-wing, if that makes sense, announced that they were not recognizing the results, that as far as she was concerned, they had alternative facts, alternative information, and this alternative information would indicate, according to her, that Edmundo Gonzalez had won by 70% of the vote, and Maduro got at best 30%. And this was posted in a website that was established actually on the 27th of July, not on the 28th. So it was already in place. So you could tell what was going on. This in the Venezuelan law is illegal. If you were to actually pretend to usurp, I think that's the verb, to usurp the functions of the National Electoral Council by announcing results to which you haven't got authority for, then you're committing an illegality, which is a crime in Venezuela. So they did this. They put this in a website, and that was extraordinary. So it created a huge amount of confusion everywhere. People were asking what is going on and so on. And the media everywhere absolutely began to actually pump this. But then this was followed on the 29th in particular, with a wave of violence throughout the country, not in every single city, but in the main cities. They attacked, typically of the extreme right-wing violence in Venezuela, they attacked hospitals. They tried to set fire on crashes with children inside and their parents. They attacked 30 ambulances. They attacked everything that is mark of public, such as ministries, vehicles, and so on. And they obviously attacked Chavistas when they thought they recognized them. And as a consequence of this, to tell a long story short, or to make a long story short, they ended up assassinating, murdering 25 people. And this was only 4 to 5 hours of violence. These people who were conducting the thing, who were actually conducting the violence, were mostly young people, very young. Some of them were kids. I was in my hotel when suddenly, the day after, on the 29th, my hotel was surrounded by about 400 of them. And the people in charge immediately gave us instructions, go to your room, lock yourself up and prepare for the worst. So we thought, let's see what happens. And we saw from our window what these people were doing. They attacked a couple of National Guards that were there, looking after the hotel, as it were. They attacked them viciously, so viciously. One of them was on the floor and wouldn't move. And they took their motorbike. I saw this with my own eyes, and I took a picture of that. And they set it on fire immediately, and they tried to block the main avenue. The idea was to block as many avenues as possible. Later on, I learned that one of the buses with some people from the United States, some international service from the United States, was attacked on the way to the airport. So they have to come back. They lost their flight and so on. So this was really amazingly fast and really brutal. And all these people who were conducting the thing, who were actually carrying out the violence, many of them were arrested and then later on confessed that they are being paid between $40 to $150. So this was not a mass of fervent right-wingers that wanted to overthrow a communist government. It was people who were mercenaries that were being paid, essentially delinquents, that were being paid by the right wing. They have done this before and so on. And they gave them, because as soon as one of them is arrested, a test is conducted about drug intaking. And all of them, according to the official information, were given something called Pentagon, I think is the actual word. It's not Pentagon, something like Pentagon, but it's not Pentagon. And it's an amphetamine. I get information.
Captagon.
Captagon, that's right. Thank you very much. It's just the Pentagon is in my head. That's what I got it wrong. Captagon, and all of them actually were given this, and this gives you a sense of exhilaration. So therefore, you commit even worse crimes. So this was controlled by the authorities in a very gentle manner, I would say, although they have to, contain it properly. It was contained. The thing faded away, and then later on, we began to hear the information that President Maduro thought we cannot accept this doubt on the probity of the election. So he went to the Supreme Court and requested the Supreme Court to carry out an investigation of all the actual votes. And the Supreme Court asked all the political parties that participated to actually give all the information they had regarding their own information, which they get when they participate in the election, which everybody is entitled to. Representative political parties in every polling station is entitled to get the results of the information of that particular center anyway, which is then immediately sent to the, their own political parties, as well as to the totalizing center in the National Electoral Council. And what was interesting was that the people who were representing Maria Corina Machado and Edmundo Gonzalez, after they were asked to turn up, they didn't turn up, and then they were asked again and again and again, and then turn up on the third occasion. And when they turned up, they formally said they had no information about any of the electoral situation of their own political party, which is really peculiar. It was the only party that did not have information. All the others did, and all the others hand over all the information to the Supreme Court. The moment President Maduro presented the motion to the Supreme Court for the investigation, literally 3 minutes later, Anthony Blinken decided to go public and recognize Edmundo Gonzalez as the president-elect. I think the intention there was to try to kill President Maduro's initiative to the Supreme Court so that the international media will overwhelm the, how can I put it, will submerge President Maduro's initiative so that actually what will dominate was the recognition by the United States, which was very interesting because 2 days later, the United States, through the White House spokesperson, made a statement saying that they were not in a position to recognize Edmundo Gonzalez as president-elect. It's the first time ever that the United States backtracked on something as dramatic as that, where the state secretary makes a statement and then withdraws it. And then interestingly, to show you who is the lackey of the United States, the government of Argentina, who had also followed Anthony Blinken's suit and had recognized Edmundo Gonzalez as president-elect, as soon as Blinken withdrew his recognition, then the Argentinian government also withdrew it. So more interesting still, we know now that Edmundo Gonzalez requested asylum in the Dutch embassy in Caracas on the 28th itself, and then later on moved to the Spanish embassy. What kind of exiles are these? I remember us in Chile looking for asylum in embassies. My God, it's extremely dangerous. You wouldn't move from one to the next. You would be dead, if you did. We moved to the Spanish embassy. He ended up in Spain. He signed several documents saying that he recognized the authorities, he recognized the victory of Maduro and so on. Later on, he said he didn't say that and so on, but we had his signature and so on. So let me tell you what I think it really happened. What the real plan was. I think the real plan was not to delay the counting of the vote. I think the real plan was to destroy the computerized system of the National Electoral Council so that the National Electoral Council could not produce any result whatsoever. In the absence of any result whatsoever, only with the information provided by Maria Corina Machado in that phony, fake website, that would be the only information that would exist on the election. That, I think, was the real plan. So on that premise, the violence that would be unleashed would create ideal conditions, not only for the coup d'etat, for a proper coup, but also for international intervention, because it would be completely outrageous, in inverted commas, unacceptable that, the votes disappear and so on. So thankfully, the system was able to survive because one of the technicians explained, he said, they tried to destroy the firewall of the national electoral system, computerized system, the National Electoral Council computerized system. And apparently, the National Electoral Council system has 15 firewalls. So if you destroy one, then you move to the next one, and then you get to the core, and then you destroy completely. So what it means is this: the United States failed in this coup d'etat. And although there is still the media, still in stories, and certainly The Guardian, the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Economist, and a few others of the bigger ones that continue to tell the story, the fact of the matter is that not a single government in the world, not one, has recognized Edmundo Gonzalez as president-elect. Not one. Interestingly, the extreme right wing, in alliance with the right wing, in the Spanish parliament, were able to pass a resolution by a majority that recognized Edmundo Gonzalez as president-elect of Venezuela. Pedro Sanchez, the governor of Spain, said, no way I'm going to recognize Gonzalez as president-elect. And interesting that being huge pressure, even the right wing was able to mobilize sufficient votes in the European Parliament. So by a majority, the European Parliament was able to actually pass a resolution recognizing Edmundo González, the president of Venezuela. But the Parliament of the European Union doesn't have any power, doesn't legislate, passes resolutions which are at best recommendations, and the Council of Europe is the one that makes the decision. They have not recognized the thing. So thankfully, the coup was defeated. Interestingly, a few days later, Maria Corina Machado, the extreme right-wing part of the political spectrum in Venezuela, organized a national, huge demonstration to, express their disgust and their opposition to not recognizing Edmundo González as president-elect. And the amount of people that they were able to mobilize would not even fill 2 blocks. I saw the picture. So that's an interesting indication, because although Edmundo González got 44% of the vote, which is real, the opposition has real basis in Venezuela, always has had between 35 to 55%, depending on particular elections. Normally tends to get to 45, 47. So to get 44 is not surprising. It doesn't mean much. Nevertheless, the very fact that those who actually were willing to participate in the extreme right-wing opposition, mass mobilization a few days after the election is an indication that this is where the United States basically has been defeated. And that is extremely interesting. So the problem is this, and I want to finish with this. What is taking place regarding the United States' desire to reassert its authority, its hegemony, again, completely over Latin America, is being done not by diplomats. Normally, it was the US ambassadors who actually were the leadership of this, making statements, intervening, destabilizing, and so on. The United States blockading, organizing aggression from outside. On this occasion, the one person who is in the lead is somebody called Laura Richardson. Laura Richardson is the commander-in-chief of the Southern Command, and she's militarizing the intervention of the United States in opposition to Latin American countries seeking alternative partners elsewhere in the rest of the world, where there is a new, very interesting multipolarity, and new geopolitical work is emerging. So it seemed to me that that is what is interesting to bear in mind. And everywhere Laura Richardson goes, not only she castigates our governments in Latin America, progressive governments in particular, for linking up with Asia and other places, but also seeks alliances with the right wing, installing military bases everywhere it can. So it's installed military bases in Ecuador, it's installed military bases in Chile, it's installed military bases in Argentina, and if Bolivia were to go, military bases would be installed over there. So you can imagine what really is going on. The United States is using military means to reassert hegemony, which is what it's trying to do in the world. I finish with this point. The United States is trying to stop multipolarity uselessly, because it's not going to be able to do it, but it's waging war everywhere it can in order to stop it. And Latin America happens to be not only cohabiting with this monster in the same continent, but also is in the front line of trying to build a new, better, multipolar world. That's why the victory of Venezuela is very important for Latin America, and we have to defend absolutely every country, progressive country, which is under the pressure of the United States for overthrowing them. And that's why it's extremely important, all our support, now that we got Venezuela secure, to Honduras. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francisco Dominguez. That was fascinating. And wow. I have more comments to make later, but I'll wait until after our next speaker, Adrienne Pine, Dr. Adrienne Pine. And she is a professor in the Department of Anthropology and Social Change at the California Institute of Integral Studies. She's a board member of Alliance for Cuba Engagement and Respect, ACERE, the Venezuela Solidarity Network, and U.S. Peace Council. She was one of the 4 people sued by the U.S. State Department for protecting the Venezuelan embassy in D.C. from the Guaido coup. She has authored many articles and books, including Asylum for Sale, Profit and Protest in the Migration Industry, Working Hard, Drinking Hard, on Violence and Survival in Honduras. Welcome, Adrienne Pine. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Barbara, and to the Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition for having me. It's really an honor to be here and an honor to share this panel with Francisco. And I'm so glad he went first because, first of all, I agree 100% with his analysis, and it lays such a clear framework for what I want to talk about, which really has to do with the interconnected nature of fascism throughout the Western Hemisphere and radiating, of course, from the sole source of empire, which is Washington, D.C., where I'm joining you from right now, the Zionist imperialism of the U.S. So what I'm going to do is share my screen. I have a PowerPoint presentation, and I will be making I'm going to be making a lot of connections and trying to fit them all in together. So I hope that'll work, and I'll try to do it as quickly as I can. So here we go. Now I'm trying to make it into the full screen thing. There we go. Okay, so I'll start
Adrienne,
out. Oh, yeah?
I'm not hearing you.
We can hear her, Barbara.
Can folks hear me? I can put my
Yes.
headphones in.
Yeah, I
Yes.
can hear you.
Everything is okay.
Okay, I'll put headphones in. Can you hear me now, Barbara? Any better? No, other folks can though. Okay. Well, I'll continue if folks in the audience aren't hearing, please let me know. Recently, as is evident from the theme of this webinar, Xiomara Castro called out a huge march to protest U.S. intervention in collaboration with the same right-wing forces in Honduras that carried out the coup in 2009. And this isn't the first time that she has come out with this assertion. And I want to go through a little bit of the background of this current attempt by the State Department to intervene in and possibly orchestrate a coup within Honduras. So the first important thing to note is that Honduras was among one of the few countries in Latin America, in the Western Hemisphere, to recognize the Maduro win in the July 28th elections immediately. This is a map from Newsweek where they just make the rest of the globe invisible to really emphasize that not many countries. And so, of course, what you see is Cuba, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Bolivia recognizing the legitimate election of President Maduro in Venezuela, and then doubling down a month later at the 11th Extraordinary Summit of Heads of State and Governments of the Bolivarian Alliance, ALBA, People's Trade Treaty. And so who you see here is Scarlett Romero, who's the Honduran ambassador to Venezuela, reaffirming their commitment to respecting Venezuela's sovereign processes and respecting the election. So that didn't sit well with the State Department, of course. And it just so happened that a week prior to the statement by Scarlett Romero, the Venezuelan and Honduran militaries were carrying out joint cadet training exercises. And so for this occasion, both the head of the armed forces and the Secretary of Defense, from Honduras, Jose Manuel Zelaya, the Secretary of Defense, who you see there, joined their cadets and traveled to Caracas and met with their Zelaya's counterpart, Vladimir Padrino, in Venezuela. They shook hands. August 28th, a couple days after Scarlett Romero made those remarks that we saw on the previous slide, what happens is Laura Dogu, who's the ambassador to Honduras since 2021, am I getting that right? 2022, sorry, early 2022, makes public declarations talking about how it was surprising and upsetting to see the Minister of Defense meeting with a known drug trafficker in Venezuela, the implication being that Vladimir Padrino is a drug trafficker, and he has in fact been indicted supposedly for drug trafficking by the United States. But I'll get into that in a minute. So following those statements on the same day, Xiomara Castro announced that she would be, because of this gross intervention by the United States, by Dogu, which was one of like dozens over the years where she's really overstepped Honduran sovereignty and really intervened in her aggressive statements. Because of this, she had ordered the foreign minister, Enrique Reina, to immediately end the extradition treaty that Honduras had with the United States as another affront to Honduran sovereignty. And so then what happened? A couple days later, rumors started circulating that the US had proof that Jose Manuel Zelaya, who is Xiomara Castro's nephew, he's the son of the brother of Mel Zelaya, to whom Xiomara Castro is married. There were rumors that his family, including his father, Carlos Zelaya, who was the speaker of the Congress in Honduras and also the head of the Libre Party in the Congress. There were rumors that he had been linked with drug traffickers. And as these rumors came out, both of them resigned suddenly on August 31st, saying that they were resigning in order to allow the investigation to carry forward. Just a few days later, then you have Insight Crime, which is an outfit run out of American University, where I thankfully no longer teach, and whose key funders include Open Society Foundation, the British Embassy in Colombia, USAID, and the International Development Research Center of Canada, among others, released video that was video that had been what do you call it? It had been held in the courts. It had never been released previously. That had been taken by one of the Rivera Hernandez brothers. These are known as the Cachiros. They ran a big drug cartel and were collaborating with the DEA. And so they were recording all of their conversations. And so the video shows Carlos Zelaya meeting with them in 2013 and with others, and having a conversation about the financing of Xiomara Castro's campaign in 2013, her presidential campaign. So this very suspicious timing of the release of this evidence, which was in US federal court and had never previously been released and was leaked to them very conveniently at a time when the US ambassador was trying to accuse the Castro administration of links to drug trafficking, and doesn't have any proof connected to it. Like there's no evidence that he ever took money. And he also claims, Carlos Zelaya claims, that he was set up, that he didn't expect to have this meeting, that somebody else. So, we don't really know what happened in the meeting, but anyway, that was very damning. And Xiomara Castro claims that is part of a clear strategy to undermine the legitimacy of the government by claiming that it's a narco government, when in fact, the previous president, who was the greatest friend to the US supposedly in fighting drug trafficking in Honduras, was Juan Orlando Hernandez, who is now serving a many decades long term for major drug trafficking and
I think you're muted, Adrienne.
sorry. So many buttons. All right. So, so all this to say that it was clear that there was a coordinated effort to discredit the Castro administration through allegations of drug trafficking that are very, very weak. In terms of this video, there's no evidence that money was ever taken or that Xiomara Castro ever had any idea that the meeting took place. But also there's this context of the whole years following the 2009 coup being, having turned Honduras into a narco state. Libre is a very different kind of party trying to carry out reforms. Now let's go into the Vladimir Padrino accusation. That one is particularly interesting. Vladimir Padrino is, the military chief in Venezuela. This is him accompanying President Maduro in his inauguration in 2019. And of course, as we all know, a couple weeks later, Barbara, you have your hand up? Oh, no.
No, I'm sorry.
Okay, we're all having click problems. A couple weeks after, or even days after the inauguration, the whole cast of characters in the Trump administration orchestrated an attempt to overthrow the Maduro administration by putting this clown Juan Guaido in as their proxy. And here he is, pictured with Leopoldo Lopez on April 30th, 2019, months after they had started their attempted coup, when they were supposed to have this big, military operation where the US had infiltrated the Venezuelan military and they were going to oust the president, and they were calling it Operación Libertad. And they were really confident that the military was going to betray Maduro, and it totally flopped. And there's Bolton trying to explain how they failed so miserably in that operation the same day in front of the White House. The reason it flopped, it turned out, was that Vladimir Padrino was the person that they had come to say, hey, you need to turn against Maduro. And he had said, sure, I'll do that. And then handed all the information over to Maduro to make sure that they were able to prevent the coup. And there's even a story of one of the coup conspirators within Venezuela talking about how annoyed he had been at Padrino because he had called him up the night before the coup, and Padrino had said, oh, I can't talk right now, I'm watching Avengers Endgame, which should have tipped him off to the fact that he wasn't in on it. But anyway, that really annoyed the State Department and the US government in general. And so it's April 30th, 2019. So a month later, they indicted him on drug trafficking charges in federal court. And the charges are tremendously weak. They're basically that on some occasions he had ordered for drug planes to be not allowed through Venezuelan airspace, but then on other occasions, some of them had made it through Venezuelan airspace en route to Central America, and therefore he was complicit in drug trafficking. And there's no evidence that we've seen presented on this. This is merely an indictment. So this is basically, again, a mechanism for the US to delegitimize a sovereign government by making accusations of drug trafficking, which then Laura Dogo used against the Hondurans for standing alongside the Venezuelans. Who's Laura Dogo? Well, those of you who work in Nicaragua will recognize her from her period as ambassador to Nicaragua from 2015 to 2018, where she worked very closely with the two major protagonists of the attempted coup in Nicaragua against the Ortega administration and against Sandinismo in 2018. So here she is in 2018, meeting both with AmCham Nicaragua, American Chamber of Commerce, and COSEP, which is the Superior Council of Private Enterprise in Nicaragua. Again, these two big business organizations that were responsible for the violent coup attempt. So after leaving Nicaragua, her next post was Honduras, where she immediately started meeting with the exact same counterparts, the AmCham in Honduras, and COEP, which is the Private Enterprise Council of Honduras. And in both of these sites, publicly denouncing the sovereign decisions of the Castro administration, to try to turn around some of the violent neoliberal fascist policies that were implemented during the coup administrations, with tremendous US Embassy assistance, that, for example, took away, dramatically rescinded labor rights for Hondurans, implemented an hourly wage law that she's talking about here that took away pensions and healthcare rights, et cetera. And also attacking the Honduran government for trying to overthrow the Sede project, which is, in a nutshell, a project by Silicon Valley libertarians to colonize big swaths of Honduras, most of them previously currently occupied by indigenous people, Garifuna people, peasants, etc. So she's really come out full force and attacked the Castro administration for trying to revert the violent and illegal coup policies. And actually, I wrote an open letter to her on November 2nd, 2022, in relation to an incident where Enrique Reina, the foreign minister, had called her in for a public meeting following remarks she had made. These remarks appear against the repeal of the hourly wage law and against the attempted repeal of the Sede law, which would allow libertarians to just steal large swaths of Honduras. This is a picture of one of the Sede advertisements, a place to build Bitcoin. That's one of them. And that's on the island of Roatan. But the wage law, there's an interesting twist there, that the ambassador herself had been directly responsible for horrible violations of the labor law and of the labor force, because their contractor, BL Harbor, which is based in Alabama and has building US embassy fortresses around the world for the past well over 20 years, was violating the rights of workers, was hiring them under the temporary wage law, which allows them only to be hired for a few months, but for 3 years at a time, denying them health care, denying them benefits, putting them into tremendously dangerous situations. And when they protested, they were faced with sharpshooters from inside the embassy. They were faced with a tremendous show of violence. They were summarily fired. Many of them were forced to migrate to the United States. So this is the context of the hypocritical context of the ambassador saying these things, and also brings us back to some important previous context, which is the prior, one of the other times when the US embassy was protested in 1988 happened to be when people were protesting an illegal extradition. If you saw, any of the news about this Honduran coup attempt, many of the newspapers falsely reported that there has been an uninterrupted extradition treaty for 100 years. But in fact, the 1982 Constitution made it illegal to extradite Hondurans. And so when the US wanted to extradite Ramon Mata Ballesteros, who was one of the biggest drug traffickers in the region, they refused, they were not able to do that legally. And so they kidnapped him. And students saw it as a violation of Honduran sovereignty, and so they vandalized the US embassy. It took it a year or two to rebuild, and that's when they started militarizing it toward the ultra militarized one that we see today. Now, this is also an interesting history because Ramon Mata Ballesteros, they weren't necessarily defending him, but rather defending Honduran sovereignty. He was popular in Honduras because, of course, at the time, it was run by a military that was running death squads that were trained at the School of the Americas and through the U.S. Embassy. And he and the Honduran government wasn't providing any services, and Mata was actually providing people free meals, all sorts of social benefits to remain popular. But at the same time, he was one of the main agents providing weapons to the Contras in Nicaragua, and was doing that on behalf of the CIA. So the CIA actually closed down its DEA operations in 1983 in order to prevent them from going after Mata. so that he could continue working for them. And it was only when he became no longer useful to them that they decided to extradite him. So it's an interesting history on both sides, and with parallels to Juan Orlando Hernandez. The extradition treaty that Xiomara Castro is revoking, the agreement only dates back to 2013, following the coup, which was pushed by the United States in order to extradite people they identified as drug traffickers, but was primarily used with the collaboration of Juan Orlando Hernandez's to oust his enemies over the course of that period. So I want to move into another topic, which is the fact that throughout Latin America, fascism is inseparable from Zionism, just as in the rest of the world. And this is one of the dynamics that we're seeing here that relates to Venezuela, Honduras, Nicaragua. Under Juan Orlando Hernandez, the coups that are carried out in support of by the United States are all pro-Israel. Juan Orlando Hernandez was the greatest friend of Israel. He studied in Mashev Academy. He received a Friends of Zion Award. He moved the embassy to Jerusalem. And he reached out when he was in US prison to Israel because he thought that they would help him, but they didn't. And meanwhile, Xiomara Castro and Mel Zelaya, when they were holed up in the Brazilian embassy, in 2009, were tortured by LRAD devices that were imported from Israel. And their position in the genocide, during the current phase of the genocide, has been very, very clear, standing up against the abuses of Israel, the actions of Israel, and calling for a ceasefire and standing in solidarity with Palestine. This is part of a broader project, and I want to just very briefly mention Colombia here. This is complex, but Colombia ties in with Honduras. I'm not going to get into these details, but I think the important thing here is that despite the fact that Petro has not stood alongside Venezuela in its legitimate election, that he's really dropped the ball on that he's betrayed them. He has been one of the fiercest leaders in solidarity with Palestine. And I think that the current attempt to oust him is not unrelated to that, right? I mean, you see anybody who stands with Palestine is going to be attacked in Latin America by the US and by Zionists, and anybody who stands with them is going to be in good standing. And I just want to point out on that note that Maria Corina Machado has a formal agreement with the Likud party in Israel, whereas the leaders of countries that are sanctioned and that are, leading the model for democracy and socialism in Latin America are all firmly on the side of Palestine. And I think, echoing what Francisco said, what we need more than ever is unity. We need clarity of analysis and unity. We need to call for an end of sanctions. And that was exactly, what Xiomara Castro did in her UNGA speech, along with calling for a ceasefire. Of course, I forgot to mention in my Nicaragua side that Nicaragua has been the greatest champion of any country, along with South Africa, in terms of its filing, at the ICJ and standing up for Palestine. This is Leila Khaled, along with Ortega and the vice president, on the anniversary of the revolution. And so we owe such a tremendous debt to Nicaragua, and the way that we protect all of these countries against US violence and imperialism is by sticking together against these threats. So thank you. I'm sorry I went over.
Thank you, Adrienne Pine. You packed a lot into that presentation. It was really very informative. Thanks so much. And now we invite our two speakers to spend a few minutes in dialogue with each other. If either of you has some comments or questions for the other, you have 5 or 10 minutes right now to talk with each other, okay?
Yeah. Well, thanks very much for that very detailed amount of information that you gave us there. My understanding is that the extradition treaty was being used by sections of the military to charge supposedly involve members of the military apparatus, generals and so on, have been appointed by Xiomara Castro so as to destabilize the country and move the army against the government with the support of the United States. I think that is a coup d'etat. And that was why the correct thing to do was to end the extradition treaty and then, be on guard. So I have a question on that, but I'll come back to the question in a second. Just on the April coup of 2019 that you mentioned there, which is known in Venezuela as the banana coup, because the soldiers were eating bananas while they were waiting. They stationed themselves outside a very important thoroughfare in Caracas, near La Carlota, which is a military base, an air base, an air military base. And they were waiting there, waiting for hours on end, which is very peculiar. Whenever there is a coup d'etat anywhere, either those who are carrying the coup do something about it, begin to take over, buildings, offices, the presidential palace, they start shooting, this sort of thing, arresting whoever it is, or the government who is the target of the coup begins to actually take counteraction by arresting people, starting to surround them and so on. Nothing happened, absolutely nothing. And that was very peculiar. There is an explanation, which is the reason why they didn't was because they expected some members of the military, possibly Padrino Lopez in this case, to come with, substantial forces to support the coup and so on. But I think there was a more sinister dimension to this. They expected the Maduro government to have a knee-jerk reaction and start shooting. And by having as many corpses as possible in the area, the more the merrier, and the media were already there to beam this information everywhere in the world. This would have justified some serious intervention by the United States and their allies. I think that was the real plan. If Guaido prepared a coup in whatever way he did, I think the real mastermind, that is to say the United States behind it, so you're not going to succeed, mate. You're going to fail, and we hope that Maduro starts shooting. And when he does, then we're going to come in. I think that was the real plan. Really sinister, typical of these days of the United States. And one other point, which is the question of drug trafficking. Venezuela is being labeled as an narco state by the United States and everybody else in the West, and certainly with the media. But from official report from the Drug Enforcement Administration, we know the following. 92% of the cocaine produced in Colombia is consumed in the United States. That's number one. But number two, more than 85% of this traffic takes place through the Pacific. Venezuela doesn't have, coast in the Pacific. So, and then if you say 92 and 85, there is 92, there is 8%, and 85, there is 15%. There's still Mexico. So Venezuela doesn't really participate at all. Nevertheless, they're not labeling Colombia as an narco state. Even worse, in 2009, the government of Colombia signed an agreement with the Obama administration, the Defense Cooperation Agreement. And in this cooperation agreement, they basically allow 7 more US military bases in Colombia. And if you read the agreement, it's really peculiar. Well, it's more peculiar, it's really worrying, because the Defense Cooperation Agreement allows the United States military in those military bases, in any particular circumstances of danger or problems or tension, to actually use any facility in the country, any civilian facility as a military facility. So if there is any port, any airport, any other thing, they could use it. And this is in the agreement. So this is very important, because not only they established 7 extra military bases with all of these conditions, which are extraordinary, but the purpose of this ostensibly was to actually fight against drug trafficking. But ever since up to now, the production of cocaine has increased by 30 to 40%, and the cultivation of illegal plants is also increased by 40 to 50%. So I read a book where it says, if you want to know when the next batch of drugs are going to produce, follow the US military bases. That's where it's going to take place. So that's extremely important to actually do this. So I have a couple of questions, if I may, Adrienne. Number one, why the coup? I mean, I know the United States hostile to any left-wing government, but when the election took place, the United States played a very passive role, peculiarly. My sense of that passivity is because the United States did not want caravans to go, if the right wing had been elected, then a caravan would have been organized almost immediately and would have blown in Biden faces, and then, would have benefit Trump, which would use immigration in the worst possible way as he does. So why the coup now? What is the reason for this? I don't think the government of Xiomara Castro is on a crisis, on the verge of collapse, or is facing economic difficulties. There is no real ostensive reason, in my view, as to why this is taking place. So maybe you can, clarify this. And finally, sorry that I made this long, but one of the very important things in Latin America in the progressive experiments, we could call them revolutions or whatever we want, is this: those experiments that have very capable political leadership survive. And those who do not have a real well-organized political leadership, however masterful they are at maneuvers, such as Lula, for example, those who do not have that sort of solid, embedding in the rank and file, with the rank and file being organized at every level in that interaction between leadership and masses. That is to say, where you have a state which is able to defend itself, they survive. And the key to the success of this is to have a political party that is able to do it. And I think Libre in Honduras is such a party. I mean, it's not a model for anybody to essentially, taking 12 years from a national popular resistance front to Libre, but it's an extraordinary experiment. It's wonderful, absolutely wonderful. So can you tell us a bit more about this? What is the significance of this? Because where you do not have this, such as, for example, in Chile, you have a massive explosion. They extracted huge concessions to the bourgeoisie, including the Constitutional Convention and possibility of a new constitution, and the bearing of neoliberalism. And then, because of political mismanagement, because of lack of leadership, we are where we are with the right wing strength, and with a president who is called Boris, which people believe is left wing. It's not. So that is a key component of everything in terms of being able to defend your revolution. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Francisco. Those are such important and key questions. First of all, I'll start with why the coup attempt. I think to answer that, we can go back to the most recent successful coup in Honduras and think about why the coup was carried out against Mel Zelaya, who was not he was not Chavez. He was not, he was not a revolutionary by any means. I mean, a lot of his policies were very business friendly, very neoliberal. He signed CAFTA, but he had started to do sort of minor reforms. He had reformed the minimum wage. He had increased the minimum wage. He had improved the pension system. He had improved access to education. And then, of course, the reason, the trigger, the straw that broke the camel's back for the business industries that Laura Dogo is now so friendly with, was his agreeing to hold a non-binding poll about whether there should be a vote on whether a constituent assembly to rewrite the Constitution should be held. And so that poll was going to be held on June 28, 2009. So it was in the wake of his making some, sort of liberal and good, not revolutionary, but important reforms, so people could survive the violence of neoliberalism better, and then threatening with actual constitutional reform. That was enough for the very powerful oligarchy closely aligned with the United States to overthrow him. And so since Xiomara Castro, as his wife, lived through this and lived through every part of it, I think they're both very well aware of how far the US is willing to go. Now, what we have in this context is, of course, they're trying to, now they're not even, the place that they're starting from is 12 years of utter devastation, the conversion of Honduras into a complete narco state, the repeal of any sort of worker and environmental protection laws. And so in their efforts to sort of get back to ground zero, get back to where they were, which wasn't a great position anyway, but was improving under Mel Zelaya during his presidency, they have pissed off the same people, and now even more people, because these predatory colonists who are, for example, trying to set up these small colonies, the sedes, in Honduras, that would remove sovereignty from these entire territories. I mean, it's really quite extraordinary. They're pissing off them too. They're pissing off all the people who were given concessions to mine, to extract resources, to otherwise, engage in land grabs. There are more people now who want to carry out a coup than even in 2009. And so these minor reforms that they're carrying out, that like the increased minimum wage law, like a very small reform to have any sort of corporate taxation, like the pushback on the sedes, Hondurans know that they really are enough for a coup to be carried out. And the other thing is that the U.S. and the oligarchy has the power. The reason for this, again, is they're far more powerful than they were in 2009 because of the neoliberal fascist restructuring of Honduras into a narco state over the course of those 12 years. The Libre Party arises from the resistance, as you mentioned. It really did an amazing job of, it's incredible that they were able to vote out a dictatorship. And that it held. Nonetheless, they don't control the military. They don't control the police. These organizations have been restructured into cartels. And so the few, the military that are aligned with Libre don't have enough power. And I think, this speaks to what you're talking about, that it would be possible for the US to use enmities within the military against Libre to, criminalize and extradite, allies of the administration. And I think if you look at the only countries that have managed to maintain their revolutions, first of all, they've really come out of popular movements that have I would say, the Libre turned into an electoral movement very soon after it became a resistance movement, right? It was in was it 2010 or 2011 when Mel came back that Libre was formed. And so it doesn't have the sort of broad base of a movement that you see in Cuba and Venezuela and in Nicaragua. But also the countries that have really managed to stave off US-led coup attempts are the ones where the military is aligned with the party. So I think that's a tremendous challenge that Honduras has, and I think it's only with the strong Bolivarian alliance among nations that that do recognize the violence of U.S. imperialism that Honduras will be able to withstand that. And I really hope
that it does, because what awaits Hondurans would be even worse. In terms of the migration question, of course, we have to go back to Kamala Harris with that, because she was the one who was first put in charge of finding out the root causes of migration, which is, of course, just talking points for neoliberal fascism. I mean, when she went on her little tour to Central America as her first act of vice president, the most famous statement was when she was standing in the Guatemalan airport and they asked her, what would you say to migrants who are or people who are considering migrating? And she said, don't come. That's my message, right? And then she identified the problems, not as US intervention and support for coups, or support for all sorts of wars and genocide and violence, but like a lack of employment, but of course not identifying the fact that the US had led the repeal of labor protection laws, right? They identify it as as security problems, when in fact all of the violence can also be related to US foreign policies in the Northern Triangle of Central America, whether we're talking about the origins of gangs or like other forms of violence. And so, migration, of course, migration is continuing. People are still fleeing, Honduras, not because of the government, but because of the policies that the government is trying so hard to get out of, but it's a slow process. And the plan, the root causes plan, has called for massive increased investment in U.S. militarization and in corporate investment in terrible jobs that are involved in land grabs and exploiting workers. And so it's the same story we've seen over and over again.
All right. Thank you, Adrienne, for your great answers and, both very strong presentations demonstrating the linkages between the situation in Venezuela as well as Honduras. We here in the United States, in North America, we need to remain vigilant about the threats to these popular movements. I wanted to reflect a little bit about Venezuela, having just returned in September. I think those who've been paying very close attention knew that PSUV and Chavismo was on the path to victory. In December 2023, President Maduro achieved a historic victory, which was the release of the Venezuelan diplomat, Alex Saab. When I saw that happen in December 2023, I knew, yeah, Chavismo's in a good place. We're just going to keep building. And since then, we've seen incredible things happen in Venezuela, between successful completion of 5 million homes through Gran Misión Vivienda. And I think they're going to build 2.5 million more. On May Day, which was kind of the launch of the campaigns. 3 million more. Thank you, Francisco. We had historic participation in a May Day rally. And those protests in support of Chavismo continued through the close of the campaign, the Thursday before the election. And the closing campaign for Chavismo had 3 million participants. This is like Chavez era numbers. There was no doubt in Venezuela who was going to win at the ballot box. Of course, we had the polling and all of the media, but on the ground, Chavismo is the best organized. And I think we have to remain vigilant about that, because there's something also very concerning happening. Solidarity Center in 2021 of the AFL-CIO had $975,000 available for Colombia and Venezuela. This year, the Department of Labor has released $12 million to Solidarity Center for its activities in Peru and Colombia. Colombia serves as a double headquarters for both Colombia and Venezuela activities. There is no information around the activities Solidarity Center intends to do in Venezuela. So I say this to say, between now and January 10th, when President Nicolas Maduro is inaugurated for a third term, we are going to be in very dicey territory. We need the solidarity of international movements. We need the solidarity of people on this call, because Venezuela is really a vanguard in protecting our movements in this hemisphere. I think This is a great webinar, and we've heard some really compelling reflections from both Francisco and Adrienne. And I think we're going to turn it over to Q&A for the next portion of this call. The first question I have is actually for Francisco from Barbara. Laura Richardson has recently said she wants to do a Marshall Plan in Latin America to compete with the influence of China there. Do you see that as any kind of pivot by the US away from military buildup in the area, or just an additional US tool?
The United States doesn't have money. It's facing a very severe economic decline, whatever is going on temporarily now. The United States GDP is 28 trillion, and the public debt is 35 trillion. That is to say, if the United States were to use everything it produces in 1 year, the largest economy in the history of humanity, to pay its debt, it will still owe 7 trillion. 7 trillion, just to give you an idea of what it is larger than the combined GDPs of all the Latin American countries, including Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico, which amounts to something like 5 to 6 trillion. The deficit, the trade deficit of the United States is staggering. All the wars in the Middle East has cost the United States 9 trillion. The United States has lost the competitive battle with China just about in every single technological area. There are a few where the United States is still number one, but out of 44 high-tech industries, China is leading 37 por ahora, for the time being, because it's likely to increase very, very soon. And the United States has no resources at all to be able to, put together a Marshall Plan, and not even in his own country. The level, the state of the infrastructure of the United States is extremely lamentable. I read the American Society of Civil Engineers report, which they produce every 2 to 3 years, in terms of what the infrastructure of the country is. In order to bring up to scratch, not to be number one, but to be up to scratch, everything which needs to be repaired and needs to be modernized in the United States, not to the highest level. The Association of Civil Engineers in the United States, considering this report, which is very thorough, that the United States will require $5 trillion, which it doesn't have. The average rate of economic growth of the United States economy over the last few decades is 2% per year. The average rate of economic growth of China is 7%. So in the next 10 years, the United States is going to be 20% bigger, and China is going to be 70% bigger. And this is driving them to despair. Even worse, China is the main trading partner of all the Latin American countries, with very few exceptions. It's number 2 in Central America, but this is being remedied very quickly because the Latin American countries are moving in that direction. And the reason is the United States doesn't have anything to offer. Mexico is the one that is really trapped in the North American Free Trade Agreement and the new version of it now, because 84 to 85% of import and export Mexico go and come from the United States. Nevertheless, this is quite fake. So in the last period, trade between Mexico and China has gone by 40%. So what better can the United States offer than, a very friendly, very giant, quite gentle economy such as China in terms of markets, technology, investment, and credit? China offers all of them in abundance. The United States offers military bases. So I think this offer by Laura Richardson of a Marshall Plan is, as you say in the United States, is BS. It doesn't have any backing whatsoever. And it's just one of these propaganda things, and one of these stunts that she makes. And the reason why she's saying this is because she wants to suggest to the right wing to say, this is what you need to tell your people so that they vote for you, so that we're able to establish military bases in your countries. Tell them that we're going to do a Marshall Plan for you. But the key existential threat, according to the report of the Southern Command in Latin America, is China and Russia that are coming in a big way. Now they've added Iran. Latin America is sovereign to actually, trade with anybody. Let me put it differently. Latin America would like to trade with the United States as much as possible. There is no complication with that. Cuba would like to have normal relations with the United States, trading relations, so would like Venezuela, so would like everybody else. The problem is the United States weaponizes any possibility that it has with the Latin American countries, whereas China functions on the principles of win-win. That is to say, when you enter into collaboration with China, everybody wins. The Chinese win, but you also win. And look at it. China can produce, trains, high-speed trains, electric vehicle, infrastructure of every kind, railways, and so on, which are being built in Latin America in the last period to the tune of $250 billion. The United States is not doing not even that much of it. So that's what it means. So I don't think we should take that seriously, but we should say no, because your Marshall Plan intends to recolonize us, as they have done with Europe already, as we know.
Well, thank you for that excellent response, Francisco. We're running very short on time at this point. I'm wondering whether we have time for a final, very quick answer from Adrienne Pine on the following question from anonymous attendee. Do you think Honduras needs a constituent assembly and a new constitution in order for the left to remain in and consolidate power, like in Venezuela?
Well, as somebody from the United States, my first caveat would be that that's up to Hondurans entirely. However, having said that, the threat of a new constitution was, as I mentioned earlier, the main catalyst for the coup in 2009. And the Libre Party stands for freedom and refoundation. And the refoundation means literally making a new constitution. So that certainly is one of the really important goals of the Libre Party. And, and I think insofar as it is, it's laudable because the 1982 Constitution was written still under dictatorship. It was written before the transition to quote unquote democracy, US controlled democracy, electoral democracy in Honduras. And it very much functions to centralize power amongst the elites. So certainly, I think that if there's any chance for a left-leaning government in Honduras to, have any sort of, to stay in power, that would be something that's very important, along with, of course, reforming the military and police to get rid of the drug trafficking infrastructure in both of those institutions. Because if one of the right-wing parties gets in through elections, they're not going to let go again. They're going to they're going to build on the narco dictatorship model that was really solidified by Juan Orlando Hernandez. So I mean, there really is a need for some serious structural reforms, both to the for the damage that was done during the coup, but then going back to what Hondurans initially identified, which is the 1982 Constitution.
Thank you. Well, as we're drawing to a close, I'm wondering whether each of the two speakers has some final brief remarks in closing, something that you want to add before we close down for the day?
Do you want me to go first?
Sure.
Yeah. Two things. Structural transformation of society in order to ensure progressive development is essential. But in my view, the economy is not the key, even though it is important. The key is the structural transformation of the state. And that is about politics. That is to say, if you're able to reform and transform the state into an institution that defends different class interests from the one that was built for, such as has been done in Venezuela, in a sort of very historically peculiar fashion, then I think that's where you can get somewhere. And I think the proof is in the pudding. The proof of the pudding is in the eating, as they say here. Venezuela went through one of the worst periods with the sanctions, which was horrific, absolutely horrific. Only between 2017 and 2018, 40,000 people died unnecessarily because of the sanctions. Pinochet in 17 years assassinated 5,000 only, if you see what I mean. So it was equivalent to throwing bombs on the most vulnerable, pregnant women, children, the chronically ill, these sort of things. It was horrific. And it was deliberate, it was nasty, it was determined, it was organized so as to demoralize people. Venezuela now has recovered massively, is 95% self-sufficient on food, which is extraordinary. In June, the level of inflation was 1.4%. In July was 0.7%, and in August was 0.8%, which is extraordinary. And the level of recovery, in the country as a whole, is extraordinary. Still, there is plenty of room for improvement, but it shows that principle socialist resistance pays off. Accommodation with imperialism will kill you, and it will destroy your society, it will set you back decades. So no matter how difficult the situation is, never, ever, under no circumstances, give up. Prefer dying fighting than giving up, because if you give up, then you're finished. There is no guarantee they're going to win if you fight, but a certain guarantee of defeat if you don't. So that's my point. Fight in a principled manner with social principles, and you can get somewhere. Otherwise, you will be defeated.
So I would just add to that by saying, first of all, I agree 100%. And secondly, for those of us who are in the United States or in Europe, I think the most important thing to recognize is that our collective futures depend on these countries and their governments and their revolutions surviving. We are impacted by the same neoliberal fascist processes. We are losing our rights. We're losing our rights to protest, to free speech. We've already long ago lost rights to healthcare or education or infrastructure or any of that, because we're spending the vast majority of our tax dollars on wars and on other sorts of infiltration and occupation, like the military bases that Francisco was talking about. So our own survival, our future is completely intertwined with the countries that are leading the way, like Nicaragua, like Venezuela, like Cuba, and and to some extent like Honduras, at least the Libre movement, trying really hard, and we need to stand together as peoples, as pueblos, because the harm that we're facing is genocidal and global, and we have models of dignity, and I'm counting on these amazing models provided by, and the amazing work from Venezuelans, Nicaraguans, Cubans, Hondurans, Bolivians to really save us, and we need to do that together.
Well,
Barbara, could I take advantage of abuse and give me 10 seconds to tell a very brief anecdote? When Manuel Zelaya returned to Honduras, a group of people who accompanied him was put together from many places. I was one of them. And when I saw this multitude of more than 1 million people, sort of waiting there for the new thing that they have created themselves by their struggle, and it was just extraordinary. It will live with me forever. So yes, we can. Not to quote Obama, but you know what I mean.
Well, that's quite a story to end with, Francisco. I can just well imagine how thrilling that must have been. Well, I want to thank both of you and everyone who contributed to this webinar today. And thank you for the people who attended, especially those who posed questions and otherwise expressed comments of various kinds. Thank you to everyone. Michelle?
Thank you all for joining us. It was great to hear from our presenters today. I learned a lot, and I am renewing my commitment to supporting these projects in Latin America. And thank you to Barbara and Stan and all others who are, leading in the Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition.
One more reminder that our next webinar will be on November 17th. Please join us again then. Thank you, everyone. Bye for now.
Bye.